I'm sure there's like 1,000 videos of people putting together their NOTAKLÖN, but when I saw this announced in December, it gave me the push I needed to finally make the Klon on my own, something I had been meaning to do for about 2 years. My friend Eric has been bugging me for one. I've had all the parts on hand, so this was the push that I needed to finally get it done, and I figured I want to do some DIY content this year. How about I show people what it's like to put together the easiest pedal possible, a solderless DIY kit, versus building your own Klon completely from scratch. Alright, so I received the pedal in late December, but all I did was open the box. I filmed myself top down putting the entire thing together from start to finish, and it took less than 15 minutes with me following the instructions. The only tools you need are a small pair of pliers to pull the PCB apart and a Phillips screwdriver to mount the back plate. The PCB is designed as what's called a panel. This allows multiple PCBs to be populated with components and soldered all together after it's been manufactured. And these panels are designed with what's called V-cuts and breakaway tabs so that they can be easily separated for assembly after manufacturing. Once you've separated the PCB, the next step is to take the board with the pots or potentiometers on it and attach one end of the ribbon cable. There's a little notch so that it only fits in one way inside the socket. Next, we're going to take the board we've just attached the ribbon cable to and mount it to the enclosure. Then the washers are placed over the pot bushings, and you can use the 10mm wrench to secure the pots to the enclosure with the nuts provided. Now we'll take the other PCB and attach it the same way, but using the foot switch. But first, make sure you put the toothed locking washer over the bushing of the switch, and also make sure that the LED is straight. Just like the other PCB, this should fit in perfectly and secure with the provided washer and nut. Alright, we're one step away from a working pedal. All you need to do now is attach the other end of that ribbon cable to the foot switch PCB. And that's a friggin' thick pick. That's crazy. And not gonna worry about the feet or the goop. I don't care too much about that. At this point, you've got a working circuit, and if you're impatient from all of that hard work, you could plug it in and try it out. But it's not going to be complete until you've attached the knobs to the back plate. And there you have it. Honestly, pedal assembly does not get any easier than that. So the first step in building any pedal is to find the instructions, and when it comes to electronic circuits, we call that a schematic. If you've ever taken an intro physics class, you've probably had to draw some diagrams with resistors, capacitors, diodes. These circuit diagrams or schematics show you exactly how to connect all of the components in an electronic circuit. The first place I came across the Klon schematic was at electrosmash.com. This site has really in-depth analyses. You can see they've got the schematic here, but whenever I am researching a circuit for the first time, I don't just trust the first schematic that I find. It's just like anything else, you can't always trust what you find on the internet, so I like to find a few different sources and compare them. I also found this article on codaeffects.com that has a DIY kit with instructions. After looking at a few schematics, I wasn't sure which type of capacitors were used where, so I wanted to see if I could find a picture from original circuit board where someone had removed the goop. After doing some more Googling and skimming over some pages at DIY forums, I came across a personal blog of a member of freestompboxes.org named Martin Chittum, and a few people from that site had pooled together some money to buy a Klon and de-goop it. So you can actually see the picture here. And, looking at this, I could see exactly what type of capacitors were used. And just by kind of comparing that with the schematic, I could figure out which ones were used where. He also posted his trace of the circuit board to the Free Stompboxes page, and in that it even includes the exact types and models of the components used. So I was pretty happy with this schematic, and I decided to go forward with this one. So once you've compared a few schematics and you're happy with the circuit that you want to move forward with, the first thing that you might want to do is build it on a breadboard. A breadboard allows you to place components and connections on the board without soldering them, so it's a good way to prototype and make quick changes to a circuit. The holes in the breadboard take care of your connections by holding them in place and physically connecting them inside the board. On a breadboard, each column is connected, and these long rows across are also connected. These are typically used for voltage and ground. I've labeled this step as optional because if you're impatient like me and you're confident in your ability to read a schematic and design a PCB, you might want to skip straight ahead to that stage. But I wouldn't suggest that if cost is an issue or you're just getting started. It's definitely easier to troubleshoot a circuit on a breadboard. And maybe you want to try out some mod that's going to be easy to swap components for different values on a breadboard. So unless you're confident in the schematic you're using and confident in your ability to design a PCB, I would go with the breadboard first. So when I go about doing a breadboard, I'm going to follow along with the schematic and highlight the circuit as I go. And one thing that I picked up early on is to focus on the nodes rather than the components. The nodes are basically the connection between two or more components. So going along this way, highlighting one node at a time, it becomes a little bit more manageable when you break it down into small pieces to go at a circuit this way. So far the steps have been pretty general. I think most DIYers or pro pedal builders are going to start off this way with a schematic or doing their own circuit design and then trying to build on a breadboard. But the following steps are going to be pretty specific to my process and the software and the suppliers that I use. So in 2020, I taught myself how to build pedals and design circuit boards by watching YouTube videos. And one of the videos I watched, the guy was doing PCB design on a site called easyeda.com. And this software runs straight from your browser, and it allows you to order PCBs from the Chinese manufacturer JLC PCB. I've been using it since I got started, but since then I've refined my process a lot along the way. At first I was just designing circuit boards and hand soldering all the components myself, but this is super time consuming. So now I like to have the PCB manufacturer solder most of the components on the board for me. So the first step, once I'm satisfied with my schematic, after I've done some research and I've breadboarded it, is to make a list of all the components and separate them by component type. So here you can see I've went through the Klon schematic and listed all of the resistors, their identifier and their values, then all the capacitors, the integrated circuits, these are the pots, the diodes, and then just the other stuff that I need. I use a little spring to make a ground connection to the enclosure. We've got the DC jack, 2 1/4-inch jacks, an LED, and a foot switch. Once I have this parts list, I'm going to sort it by the unique component values. And you can see here I've got the notes of which ones are film capacitors, electrolytics, 1 tantalum capacitor. What I'll do now is go through the parts library at JLC PCB and try and find parts number for all the components. It's really useful to look up these parts numbers because when I go to draw my schematic, I'm going to add these specific parts numbers and then they're going to have a footprint attached to them. So when you convert that schematic to a PCB design, you don't need to go back and edit everything to make sure you have the right footprints for the right components. If you just use the generic resistor or capacitor symbol, it's not going to have the right footprint for the particular component that you want to use. So you can see here I've gone through this whole list and found the parts number for each of the components that I want to use. The only ones that I left off are the germanium diodes. They're not going to be in stock. I'm actually not going to be able to find 1N34A, but I do have some Russian germanium diodes that I'm going to try and use. And then I'm going to solder the pots, the foot switch, and the LED myself. So in order to do the PCB design, we're going to have to redraw the schematic in EasyEDA. So we're going to start by opening up a new schematic, and we're going to use that parts list to place all the components. So in this blank project file, we're going to open up the library here, copy this part number, and we're going to be able to place each of those components. So I've got 200 nanofarad capacitors. We'll move down the list. Okay, and I'm going to go through adding each of the parts this way.
Many minutes later.
So now that we've got all the parts placed, we can go through and start to redraw the schematic. So just like when I was breadboarding, I'm going to follow along with the schematic using a highlighter, working through it one node at a time. So here's the schematic that I've redrawn in EasyEDA. Before I go any further, I will spend some time like double checking this against the original drawing just to make sure. And definitely, like, if you made note of any parts changes or discrepancies between the schematics that you want to look at, like, it's good to make a note of it here. Now that we've got the schematic complete, we could move on to the PCB design, but before we do that, we're going to switch gears because I actually like to figure out what the pedal is going to look like first. And the main reason I want to do that is because I want to know, where am I going to put the pots, where am I going to put the jacks, where am I going to put the foot switch. So by figuring out what it's going to look like first, we can, place those big components on our PCB design and then sort of fill in the rest later. So the first thing that I'm going to do is decide the size of the enclosure that I'm going to use. I'm going to be ordering from Tata, and I could probably fit it in a smaller enclosure, but the idea that I have, I think is going to look really good in this 1590 BB style, in this chromium color. Now, if you go to the UV printing page, you can find the artboard sizes for the different pedals. We're going to do the 1590B, so we need an artboard size of 90 by 115 millimeters. So to start designing the look in Adobe Illustrator, I'm going to open up an artboard with the size that we found, 90 by 115 millimeters. That looks like this. And this is the time I start to think about the placement of the hardware. So what I've done here is I've looked up the data sheets for the components that I'm going to use, and I've just done a rectangle based on, the rough size of them. So I'm planning to put some top mounted pots on this, and the footprint of that you can see is 9.5 by 7 millimeters, and I found that information by looking at the data sheet for those specific components. So we've got 3 pots that are going to go on the top, an in and out 1/4 inch jack, a DC jack, and a foot switch. Now, I also like to mock up what the hardware is going to look like, so you can see, like, probably around here in the center I'll have the foot switch and an LED. I'm going to use some blue knobs on top, and the reason I chose to do that is because of the design, and I had this idea to do something based on a Klondike bar, so I basically copied the Klondike logo, changed it to say Klon-like, used the original Centaur drawing, and As you already know, this is not an original circuit. So now that we've got the look and we know where the hardware is going to be placed, we can start the PCB design with that information. So in the next video, we'll pick up where we left off and show you a bit more of the PCB design, and we'll go from there. If you're interested in the Klon-like pedal though, I am opening up a pre-order for the next few weeks. So if you want to grab one, go to my website, jfxpedals.com. Thanks for watching.